All right, here we're going to talk about natural selection, and hopefully I'll correct any misgivings you have or misunderstandings you have about what it actually is. And we'll talk about different patterns of selection. Now, most of you know that Charles Darwin was is considered the developer of the theory of natural selection. But there was also a second naturalist by the name of Alfred Russel Wallace. He's one of my favorite. He was working in Indonesia, in Sulawesi actually. And he independently came up with the theory of natural selection. They actually presented it together at a meeting. However, Charles is the one that gets all the credit for it. Now, what it is actually differential survival and differential reproductive ability. It's not this idea of survival of the fittest, the longest in the tooth, or that. That is really not what natural selection is about. This is reproduction of the fittest, and it is not just it's as simple as just reproduction, but it's among these alternative, the fittest among alternative possibilities that are present in a generation in a given space and time. So, if I remind you, one of the conditions of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is that we assume that all gametes have an equal probability of contributing to the next generation, and that each individual contributes the same number of gametes. That's an inherent assumption of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Everybody has the same probability of reproducing, and everybody has the same probability of contributing the same number of gametes. Okay? So that is what is actually meant by no selection. Do you think that everybody has the same probability of reproducing? Do you think that everybody has the same probability of producing an equal number of gametes? Probably not. But that's what we mean by differential survival and differential reproductive ability. Now, in terms of the principles of natural selection, these are the three really important ones. Number one, you've got to have allelic variation. This is that idea of genetic variation in a population. You don't have any genetic variation, natural selection is not going to be able to act. Now, the second principle is this idea that beneficial alleles will allow individuals to survive and reproduce. Not just to survive, but also to reproduce. And then finally, that over many generations, these allele frequencies of many different genes can change through natural selection. So natural selection acts on phenotypes. Those phenotypes ultimately are derived from an individual's genotype. But this is what natural selection is acting on. It's acting on a phenotype of an individual. Now, a modern description of natural selection can relate the molecular genetics to the phenotypes of these individuals. So the allelic variation arising from various factors such as mutations causes these differences in DNA sequences. Then the distinct alleles are going to may encode proteins of differing functions. And then that can actually alter the characteristics of a species and affect their ability to survive and reproduce. Now, based on that previous discussion about differential survival and differential reproductive ability, I want to talk about what actually Darwinian fitness is. So this is let's just say it this way. It's a relative likelihood that a genotype will survive and contribute to the gene pool of the next generation. That is Darwinian fitness defined. So it's a measure of the reproductive advantage of an individual. Now, this is a very simplistic derivation of this concept of an individual and all their genes, right? Because we have many genes, and so it's not, you can't just measure one fitness estimate or take one gene or one genotype and produce a fitness estimate for an individual. Now, this is an example of it, though. This is how you might approach it and how it's done in population genetics. So the genotype that has the highest reproductive ability is given the fitness value of 1. So basically we're normalizing it. So if this phenotype produces 5 offspring, and then these other 2 phenotypes only produce fewer offspring, then we can generate a fitness value, a Darwinian fitness value for the homozygous dominant individual of 1. For the heterozygote that has 4 offspring, we take 4 and divide it by 5. That gives us just a 0.8. And then finally for this one down here, we divide 1 by 5 to get 0.2. So that's a Darwinian fitness value for these genotypes, for these individuals exhibiting these phenotypes. Now, there's reasons for differences, right, in reproductive success, and you can think of those in and of for yourselves. But in general, we can talk about this fittest genotype could be more likely to survive, it could be more likely to mate, and it could also be more fertile. Now, that can lead to these differences in reproductive achievement. So one of the things I want to stress again that remember that most traits are affected by variation in multiple genes. So it's typically not a single gene that's controlling a trait. So that's why it's really hard to assign realistic fitness values to individuals. But this is what you have to do to really get at natural selection and how natural selection is working. Now let's talk about some different forms of natural selection. So the first is directional selection. That's probably one of the most intuitively easy to understand. So in this situation, we have a population that was originally monomorphic for the little a allele. And here in this graph, we're going to look at the increase in the frequency of the big A allele over time. Now, directional selection in general favors the survival of one extreme phenotype that's better adapted to an environmental condition. Okay, so it's going to favor that one, so that one is actually going to be able to survive and reproduce at a higher fitness value than any of the other genotypes that are present. Now, in this case, we get the introduction of a big A allele. Now, the frequency is going to slowly rise, as you can see in this region of the graph, and then it'll reach a certain point where it's going to actually increase quite frequently until eventually it becomes fixed. So directional selection acts to actually decrease genetic variation in a population because these two that have the big A allele actually have a much higher reproductive fitness or Darwinian fitness than those that are homozygous or that carry the recessive allele. Well, actually, it's compounded here. Now let's look at an example of this. This would be a real-time kind of example, something for all of us to be concerned about, is resistance in mosquito populations. This one is specifically data for DDT resistance, and thank goodness we don't use that anymore, but this is the kind of thing that can happen with directional selection. And I wanted to illustrate this because we take those fitness values or those Darwinian fitness estimates, and we can use those to weight the next generation, or what we expect to see of those genotypes in the next generation. So we can estimate what the frequency of the homozygous dominant would be based on the fitness value and the frequency of those alleles in the population. So we can do that also for the heterozygote and for that homozygote recessive individuals. So that's how you can actually use the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium or Hardy-Weinberg equation over successive generations to estimate what's going to happen under this type of selection, i.e. directional selection. So that would be a 1, this would be a 0.8, and this would be a 0.2. So you're weighting the expected numbers of individuals that you would see with this these genotypes in the next generation. And as you can see here, this is actually real data looking at the percentage of survivors after exposure to DDT. And you can see that there's fluctuations that could be due to the size of the populations. But ultimately, we're going to see this allele, whatever allows these to survive, has a much higher frequency, that allele is eventually going to go to fixation when you've got that directional selection pressure on it. So there again, we're decreasing the amount of genetic variations in the population. Now, a second type of selection is really pretty cool. This is balancing selection, and the concept of a balanced polymorphism. Now, in this situation, or this type of selection, favors the maintenance of two or more alleles. We saw in directional, you're going to tend to go to fixation. Here, we kind of develop this happy medium, where in equilibrium, where you got these opposing selective forces that balance each other out. So we're not actually evolving toward fixation or towards elimination. And one of the things that's kind of cool about it is that this is actually a really good explanation for why you see high frequencies of deleterious alleles. And remember, deleterious alleles could be, they're ones that are going to reduce the ability of an individual to survive. So they cause harm, if you will. And this is demonstrated in here, where you've kind of got these frequencies that are converging on this this equilibrium, and this is a balancing, if you will, where you maintain both of them and you don't select. The selective forces are kind of they're balanced. An example of this is seen, or a classic example of this, seen with the HBS allele of the human beta globin. So remember that if you have both of these slow alleles, then you displayed sickle cell anemia. If you don't have the slow alleles, then you're phenotypically normal. Now, what we know is that individuals that are heterozygotes have a higher fitness in areas where malaria occurs. So they have a better chance of survival if Plasmodium falciparum gets into them. This is referred to as heterozygote advantage. You also know it as overdominance. So in these areas, even though this HBS allele is deleterious, it decreases the fitness of the reproductive fitness of the individual simply because it decreases their health. It affects their health. So even individuals that are heterozygote, they actually have sickle cell trait, which is not the same thing as sickle cell anemia, but is still decreases their health. And I'll just leave it that way. The third type of selection is disruptive selection. Now, this type of selection actually favors the survival of two or more different genotypes that have different phenotypes. This is also known as diversifying selection. So this can actually tend to increase genetic variation in a population. So you're going to have, in this situation, you're going to get selection for individuals that are on either end of these extremes, that are more different than what you've got in the middle here. So that leads to this bimodal distribution in terms of these numbers of individuals. A classic pattern of this is seen with snail color or shell color. So this would be the same population, but the individuals that live in the woods and the open live in the woods with open soil tend to be more brown in color, and their shells are more brown in color. Whereas individuals that live in woods that have leaf litter, they tend to be pinker in color. And you can actually have these living in areas with sunny, grassy areas. They're not even in the woods. And then those tend to have more of a yellow shell. So there you can get selection for certain colors based on your habitat, and yet that results in selecting for different genotypes or phenotypes in a population. Now, the final type of selection is stabilizing selection. Now, this is exactly the opposite of, very different from diversifying selection. in the sense that the extreme phenotypes in this case, so out here where you have a few eggs or many eggs, those are actually selected against. So what you're actually doing over time, so this would be time here, you're tending to take this broad normal distribution and shrink it down to a much tighter normal distribution. So you're getting into a narrower range of phenotypes. In this case, it's actually clutch size. So it favors the survival of the individuals that have this intermediate phenotypes. You can think about this realistically. If you have too many eggs, then that's going to be a negative because that's going to drain your resources and be harder for you to care for those young. If you have too few, then you're not going to be contributing as many individuals to that next generation. So right in here, it's just right in this region. Now, does this increase or decrease genetic diversity in a population? Well, it could tend to decrease it if you're selecting against some of these outliers out here, right? So I would say that it actually decreases genetic diversity in a population. So that is a very brief introduction to natural selection. I hope you got something out of it.